Welcome to the George Washington University. We will now begin our program, Addressing Researcher Harassment, a fireside chat and panel discussion to launch new researcher support tools. Please welcome the Director of the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics, Dr. Rebecca Tromble.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this important event, addressing the growing number of attacks targeting researchers across disciplines and at all levels within our universities. I'm Rebecca Tromble. I am Director of the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics, and also an Associate Professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs here at GW. Today, we will be talking about the ways in which scholars working on topics ranging from climate science to gender studies, from biomedical research to sociology, physics, to my own field, political communication and technology studies. So many scholars across disciplines, across fields, are facing unprecedented levels of intimidation and harassment from external actors who aim to discredit, delay, or end their work altogether. As we'll hear today, these campaigns of intimidation and harassment have dire consequences, not just for the researchers, but for their institutions, for universities like this one, and for society as a whole. While such attacks are often understood in isolation as separate campaigns targeting individual researchers, specific projects, or topics, we need to take a step back and recognize that these campaigns are part of a wider endeavor to undermine the credibility of higher education and to reduce trust in science and scientific knowledge. Higher education and scientific inquiry are bedrocks of a democratic society. They are vital to the free exchange of information and ideas, to progress that benefits our economy, our communities, and our lives. Attempts to silence researchers threaten each of these vital public goods. They also threaten the fundamental rights of the researchers themselves. Researchers have a right to pursue lines of inquiry that they choose, to offer their perspective and knowledge with the stakeholders they deem relevant, and to work with and inform the public. This is part of the researcher's own fundamental rights to freedom of expression. Today, we'll hear from several scholars who have been targeted for their important public interest research, and I'm incredibly grateful for their bravery in joining us to tell their stories today. I know we'll learn a great deal from each of them. However, while seeking to better understand the core problem is really important, it's also essential that we focus on solutions. In fact, today serves as the launch of the new Researcher Support Consortium, which my colleague Katie Searles and I have created to provide information and resources to institutions, particularly universities, about how they can better protect and support researchers facing intimidation and harassment. I'll share more about the Researcher Support Consortium a bit later in the program, but first, it's my distinct honor and pleasure to kick off this discussion by introducing colleague Holden Thorpe. Holden Thorpe is Editor-in-Chief of Science and also a Professor of Chemistry here at George Washington University. Professor Thorpe is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Inventors, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Please help me welcome Professor Thorpe to the stage.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks for all you're doing. Let's hear it for Rebecca and all the amazing work she's doing. Listen, you all are in for a treat. I could have just stayed in the green room and listened to all these superstars for the rest of the afternoon. It's going to be absolutely amazing. As Rebecca said, I have the distinct honor of being the Editor-in-Chief of Science. Science is a publication that does three things. We have news. We have 30 journalists who report on science news around the world. We have commentary, where scientists write about science for each other. I have the privilege of writing the editorial every week. And then we have one of the most selective research journals in the world that publishes in all fields. And as the editor-in-chief, I get to see everything that goes on in this matrix. And the issues that we're here to talk about are always on my mind because we see our role as being crucial in standing up for research. Because when we decide to publish a paper, we're making a commitment that if there's a problem with that paper, we're going to help address it. And if someone attacks that paper unfairly, we're going to stand up for it. And those are two hard things to do at the same time. But we take our responsibility for doing that very seriously. And I worry very much about the institutions and their role in this. Because with all the fraught politics that we have out there, a lot of the institutions are backing away from standing up for the findings of research. Some of them will say we're neutral, we're the home to critics, we're not the critic itself, so we'll support the faculty who use their expertise to spread knowledge with the world, and we'll defend them and their right to do that. But they are increasingly stopping short of saying, and because this research was done according to sound principles of science, and because it has stood up to repeated experimentation, we also stand up for what's in the paper. And the institutions are increasingly backing away from that. And so that leaves the journals and the authors themselves. And so that therefore makes it easier to undermine the research by attacking the authors, because while they may well have the support of the institution in saying we support their right to do this, they don't necessarily have any longer the institution to say, and we also believe what they're saying is true. Because the definitions, the evolving definitions of free speech in this country apparently make space for saying things that are against scientific consensus and have no evidence. And we've seen lots of examples of that during the pandemic where things have gotten a whole lot worse. But it's not a new phenomenon. I teach a class over in the chemistry department, which is mysteriously listed in chemistry, but that's where I am qualified to have tenure about these topics. And the word has gotten out among the students, so I mostly have poli-sci majors now. Love to get some journalism students if anybody wants to sign up. It's Chem 1000. But we start with these topics in the 80s. And in the 80s, around climate change and the ozone hole and smoking and things like that, we had these same kinds of attacks. And, Ben Santer and Roger Revelle, for example, were very unfairly attacked for their research on climate change, but it stopped short of the kind of harassment and even physical intimidation that we're seeing now. And so one of the things I try to lead the students through is, first we talk about what happened in the 80s, and then we talk about what's happening now, and they can see how social media and the internet and the political environment we're in have all contributed to this. So this is really a superb panel an event that has been put together and helping to define how institutions can engage. And Rebecca thankfully gave me a short introduction, but before I was the editor of science, I was the provost of Washington University in St. Louis, and I was the chancellor of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I learned the hard way that the worst thing a president can do is stay in their office and be scripted by their comms people and their attorneys. And once I left North Carolina after making a sequence of those mistakes that you're free to read about on the internet, I haven't done that since. And I'm constantly imploring my colleagues, who I realize are all in very difficult situations, that they need to be themselves and share the thoughts in their mind that they know are correct, rather than, because we're in such a dangerous and noisy political environment that you're not going to script your way out of this situation. And so thanks to Rebecca and her center for pushing for the right things on this. I also want to put in a plug, so you're going to hear from Kate Starbird And she and one of her colleagues wrote a really terrific piece in Science that I solicited called Academic Freedom is in Peril, which is about some of the events that you are going to hear about today. So thanks to Rebecca and these outstanding panelists for coming. Great to be at the School of Journalism at my home university, and I can't wait to hear all the great things we're about to hear.
Hi, friends. Hi, so I'm Brandy Zadrozny. I'm a senior reporter at NBC News. I write about this subject quite a lot. What was a subject about clearly just misinformation, disinformation, and extremism, suddenly these folks became sort of the main characters in a lot of this work, much to their chagrin, I'm sure. So thank you, Dr. Thorpe, for those remarks. Really appreciate it. Hope to build on that in our discussion now. These two don't really need an introduction, but I will do it anyway because that is my job. Sitting right next to me is Renee DiResta. Until recently, she was the research manager for Stanford Internet Observatory. She, at Stanford, she did really groundbreaking work about the COVID debacle, about misinformation during the era of COVID, and about the election. And she's also written an incredible book about becoming the main character and sort of showing the architecture of all these lies and how it works. It's brilliant. It's called Invisible Monsters, and she's really great. So please welcome Renee. Oh. And that's Invisible Rulers, not Invisible Monsters. I just
good alternate title.
How? Okay, and then of course Kate Starbird. She is an associate professor at University of Washington. Is that right?
I just got promoted.
Oh my God! Congratulations.
Went into effect 3 days ago.
And she's the founder of the very wonderful and helpful and informative Center for an Informed Public. And they've done a lot of great work in terms of, again, COVID and the election, especially, I think, as a journalist, I used them so much for their rumors around the election, trying to understand what was happening before we really could understand what was happening when it came to the election in 2020. About all of the rumors that we were seeing about mail-in ballots and the confusion, and as the lies poured out, they documented them and showed their spread and did a lot of good work there. So I actually started following Kate a million years ago because she was doing really interesting work on collective sense-making around the Boston Marathon. And that work for me really showed, as an internet reporter, how people could organize on the internet in a way that they didn't mean to cause harm, but could really do a lot of damage. And that work was really prescient. So obviously we're here today. This is our topic. A big part of this is personal for y'all. And so if I could, I just want to open the floor to you and ask if you could just tell the short story of how you became the main character in some of these conspiracy theories and what effect it had on you personally.
Who gets to start? The other person will go, they're kind of intertwined. So.
You're talking, so let's go.
Well, I guess I am. Yeah, I don't even, it's hard to, I think we'll both have different stories about very similar things, about when we began to realize what had happened. But we did a lot of research in 2020 in particular around rumors about the election processes and procedures and results. And of course, many of you know that those culminated in sort of the big lie, January 6th, and those rumors were mobilized to try to sort of contest the election. We did that work. We published a final report. It was cited in the January 6th committee's report. And we felt pretty good about having done this work to help document things. And we've done some real-time work as well to help people be aware of what was happening and help reporters cover it, other kinds of things. Maybe 2022 in the summer, as the January 6th committee hearings are happening, became aware of just some chatter online that was a lot more negative and some articles that were out there. By September of 2022, started to get inquiries from partisan media outlets that had sort of leading questions. And I'm like, what are they getting at? What did they think we were doing? That had sort of like, we could see there's some conspiracy theories behind them. And then I started getting threats. People online said, you need to get a lawyer. We're coming at you. We know you did this and this. I'm like, what are you talking about? And so eventually it was sort of online harassment, partisan media, lawsuits, and then congressional investigations. And by the spring of 2013, became aware that we were the target of investigations happening within the Weaponizing Government Committee. I might have said that name wrong, but you know what I mean. And that we were going to be sort of a centerpiece in the political theater that they were going to play out there.
My experience was mostly the same. I saw the first articles about us. We were actually having the Stanford Trust and Safety Conference in September of last year when several of us got media inquiries from a right-wing outlet. And, you know, we had, there was a blog that had popped up that had made a bunch of like absolutely insane allegations, just saying things like we had censored 22 million tweets, we were like, you know, being paid to silence conservatives, and just this series of things where you initially think this is so ludicrous that nobody is going to take this seriously. But in the age of just asking questions, what you start to see is that a person who puts up a site and says these sorts of things actually becomes, you know, I think the media term is rent-a-quote, right? Where they become a sort of useful person, where they become the citation over and over and over again. Every single outlet that wants to tell this story of supposed conservative censorship, can quote the same guy. And so, you know, and it's very interesting because one outlet then quotes the next, and they'll say things like, as reported by outlet A. And so there's almost nobody responsible for the central claim, short of this, you know, the sort of one figure who kind of sets themselves up as the supposed authority. And you watch this travel, you watch this traverse the internet, and we started getting these media inquiries, and you find yourself in this very interesting position of, do you respond, right? And this is where there's some back and forth. Even in the field, there's some differences of opinions about, do you legitimize the story by giving a quote and being in it? Do you ignore the inquiry? Do you try to put out a fact check? And what you realize very quickly, because we did eventually put out a fact check in response to one of these articles, is that you know, you get a litany. I don't know if people know the phrase gish gallop, but it's when a series of arguments that are like so numerous that the target is momentarily kind of frozen as you try to decide which one to respond to first, and then second, and then third, and then fourth, and then God forbid you don't respond to point number 9, then a whole new article will appear about how point number 9 is the real story. And that's exactly what happened with us. And so you begin to realize that you're in this damned if you do, damned if you don't environment, where if you respond, you're going to be targeted, and if you do not respond, you're going to be targeted. And this begins to lead to, again, in late fall of 2022, the House hadn't yet flipped, but after it did, it was very clear to those of us who had been on the receiving end of these media inquiries and these media cycles for several months that it was highly likely that we were then going to be subject to congressional investigations, and the question was only what form would the pretext take to justify that investigation to the public. And so that was sort of the, you know, and I write about this in detail in the book, actually, that process of pretext creation, and my personal astonishment at how flimsy it actually was, at how little pretext there actually had to be in order to justify Jim Jordan reading my emails, right? And that, I think, is the, that for me was, I kept asking our lawyers, like, when is the part where the facts come out? when is the part where we get to the truth? You know, and then being, you know, sort of sympathetically nodding at me, like, well, you know, maybe someday that happens.
Can I call it one piece there? I do remember September of 2022, we're all at a conference together. We get this, the attacks that we faced are kind of together because we were on the same project together, and a lot of the attacks were about that project. The project was big and it was distributed. There were 4 groups, and they were all just happened to be at a conference together. And we had this meeting, and I remember thinking, gosh, we should respond. We should get a response together. And we got talked out of it by some of the other people in the room. They're like, it's not worthy of a response. And I think that was a critical error that we made. We didn't get a response out for 6 months. And the claims against us had already been laundered into congressional testimony before we put out a correction. It was absolutely the worst thing we could do. We didn't have to respond directly to them, but we had to have gotten our truth out there, and we did not do that quickly enough. And that is a mistake that I will not make again, and would highly recommend if something comes at you or your researchers, you don't have to respond to those people directly. You do have to get your truth out into a place where people that would want to defend you could find it.
And I think it's important to not glom over or not pass over the actual effect that this stuff has, right? You're sort of talking about a waste of time, essentially, but there's so much more that comes with it. Can you just get into the actual effect personally and on your work that this, I don't even know, these shenanigans, this targeted campaign of harassment has caused?
I hate to give them the power of hearing how much they put us like just spinning in circles. I would say, like, for me personally, it probably cost a year of productivity from my research. I couldn't let it affect my teaching and other kinds of things, but my research. Fortunately, I have a lot of collaborators and a lot of amazing students, and the work went on, and I don't think they saw the impact. But my personal ability to engage with the research was all siphoned off into trying to like assemble the team of people that were going to help me and my colleagues fight back. And that was, until that happened, I can't explain to you the stress from the moment of like, what is going on? How am I going to fight back this, and how do I get my university to pay attention to what's happening and help me? And it was super stressful. I will say by the summer of 2023, my wife is like, you've got to go get a counselor. I can't hear these stories anymore. They don't make sense to me, and you seem to be very stressed. I was extremely stressed. But how do you like relate all these conspiracy theories that are about you and why they matter to a person who's like, what, that just sounds crazy. I'm like, I know, but like they're gonna pull me into these, I have to go to DC. And she's like, you need a counselor, and I went to the counselor for a couple sessions. But by the end of the third session, I told the counselor, I didn't need the help anymore. And she said, well, what has changed? And I was like, well, I now know my university is behind me. And once I had that institutional support, I no longer needed to complain to my wife and all these other kinds of things. But that was really the thing that turned it for me. Is once I had some communications help, once I knew the university was going to help me in the legal stuff, they were going to give me great representation at the congressional interviews I had to do. Once that was in place, it really did take the pressure off.
I had kind of an interesting experience because I'm not tenured, I'm not faculty, right? I don't have a PhD. Soft money center. The university was extraordinarily supportive on a legal front and continues to be, and I'm very grateful for that because it's extraordinarily time consuming and very, very, very expensive. I had some really interesting kind of inbound like outreach from people as the stories began to like reach mainstream media, as other people began to become aware, where some climate scientists reached out to me and they were like, I want to tell you what your next year is going to be like, right? And then they just laid it out for me. Michael Mann was like, I wrote a book about this, the hockey stick and the climate wars, and I went and I bought the book, and I went and bought Naomi Oreskes' book, Merchants of Doubt. And sure enough, everything that they described and everything that in my conversations that some of the climate scientists who'd been targeted in 2012 with congressional hearings, with lawsuits, with this thing called ClimateGate, with their emails, all of the things that they had laid out to me did in fact happen. Now for me, I like to argue, I like to fight. This is my personality. And what I found the most frustrating was that the university was like, say nothing, do nothing, right? Because I felt like we were actually misdiagnosing, we were miscategorizing the fight that we were actually having, which is, yes, there's a lawfare component to it, and that requires certain ways of comporting yourself, certain things you can't comment on, ways in which, sorry, I cannot comment on that matter due to pending litigation is a sentence I memorized, right? And so you have this, this legal process that's happening, but where some of the misunderstanding, like the frustration for me personally was also realizing, as Kate noted, that the rumors were going to ossify and that they were about me personally. They were about some of my colleagues very personally, right? It's my face in that profile on InfoWars. It's my kids who are getting threatened in the comments. And the thing that I found so outrageous was that they didn't recognize the communication war component to it, or why you did have to have your information and your story out there. And the source of frustration for me on that was that I did nothing wrong, and I wanted an opportunity to articulate that. And I wanted to connect the dots and explain to people how this machine functioned, what it did, and more importantly, why it was doing it, and also the parallels to what, again, had been articulated to me by the climate science folks. Like, literally, this is what is going to happen to you, and that's exactly what happened. And so very randomly but conveniently, I did have a book deal, and it was mine, and nobody could control it but me and my editors, right? And so for me, that did turn into, like, even as much like Kate, my research focus shifted. I spent a lot of time rereading my own emails as they went back out the door, making sure that emails and things with our students' names on them were appropriately redacted, because again, I feel like some of us you understand the stakes when you're the adult doing it, and like you understand that like the internet will come for you and what that's like. You have to protect the people who do not understand that, who have not opted into that. And so that was very important to me, and making sure that that the university agreed that we all took care of the students. But I did feel like, okay, I set out to write a book about influence and propaganda. It just became a memoir, and I'm going to tell the whole story in there. And like that really for me became a way to say, even if my research agenda is changing, even if I'm spending all my time reading my own emails, at least here in the end of all of this, like I will be able to tell the story.
I think there's a really popular sort of wisdom that's don't feed the trolls, and I think that was early internet wisdom. And the more and more we learn about how things work now, it's just dismantled for me. That nature loves a vacuum, conspiracy loves a vacuum, and when you don't talk, people will fill in that hole for themselves, whether it's getting your emails and making up this whole news story about this is what she thinks, this is what they think, this is what they're doing. And at the very least, being able to tell your story and being willing to tell your story, and then being able to tell your story, because I work at a big news organization, you guys work at big schools. I think that there is a lot of just people don't want to get involved. People just want to tighten up and say it'll be over soon, they'll move on to the next ones. But I think that you've shown us they do not move on. When they catch a big one.
I knew in September 2022, they're not going away.
Yeah, same.
I'd been seeing it for weeks already, and I was like, this is going to stick. And I was trying to convince these guys who had been journalists and other kinds of things. So like, this is actually going to be a thing. Well, the interesting thing is it stuck to us, and not to them. And possibly because we fought back a little bit more, but also I think we also knew that in this kind of environment, we're more likely to be the targets of this, and they can get away with hiding their heads. There is a little bit of that calculus, and there are folks who I think it's the right move to hide your head and let it pass. But if everyone hides their heads, like they're going to pick us off one by one. So what does it mean to kind of like, get out there and say, this isn't okay? And that's some of the calculus that we had to play with as well. And in my organization, I think I've said, if I can be the lightning rod and everyone else can keep going, I'll be the lightning rod. That's easy enough for me.
What else concerns you about this environment? Other disciplines, other industries, and students, people younger than you or without your university protections. What else besides personally do you sort of worry about when it comes to this?
I think it is. I mean, the chilling effect is real, right? And when your own sort of First Amendment rights are, all of a sudden your First Amendment protected work is twisted, and the intent of the inquiry was not to be a fact-finding mission to craft legislation to solve a problem. That's not what this Congress was doing. That's not what that committee, I should say, was doing. What happens there, though, is that it becomes, students get very nervous, right? Very, very nervous, because again, some of their emails were not redacted by some of the journalists that pulled from the Twitter files and things like this, leading to harassment of 20-year-olds, right? This is a real thing that happened. There's a cost there, right? There's also and I felt terrible about that. Of all the things, again, like my email, whatever, this is not my first rodeo with people on the internet being mad, but for some 20-year-olds, I mean, come on. It's irresponsible, it's unethical, and it's terrible. I think the bigger, besides that though, it's incredibly costly. So if you do not have a university that can or will provide support, I think that becomes a source of shifting what they're willing to pursue. The goal of academia, the entire, and I'm not going to lecture anybody on tenure because I don't have it, but as I understand it, as an outsider, the principle is supposed to be that it protects people's inquiry, like their right to do inquiry into potentially controversial topics, their right to pursue research or work that might not be done in the private sector for various reasons, or might not be done in government for that matter for various reasons. And when you see that, I think the net effect is this conviction that whether you have protection or not, like you're actually very targetable. People can quite easily disrupt your work and in service to pursuit of political power.
Building off of that a little bit, I would say like what we haven't seen is a chilling effect on the students themselves. Like the students are banging on the doors to get into our research labs. Like the number of folks that are truly qualified who've said, hey, look, I'm going to apply for a PhD, and I'm like, we have a lot. We can't accept you all, but I'm excited to see your application. We've just got we're hiring for folks this fall. We had 80 applications for 10 spots. Right?
Are they heartened by what they're seeing? Is this like a response in sort of solidarity or excitement?
I don't even know if they see this part. Mm-hmm. I think they just they care about this kind of work. These things, they see these affecting their lives, their friendships, their family relationships, and other kinds of things. And they're excited to do this kind of work. And so that I'm not worried about. What I'm worried about is what happens next when they come and they get that PhD. And I'm worried about a chilling effect at the institutional level, where the institutions are like, oh, I don't want to defend against this kind of research. And it's not just happening in our field. We happen to study this too, which is why we're probably here and more interested in it. But there's a lot of folks doing different kinds of research, whether it's on gender or race or any number of things that are targeted with the same tactics. Climate, these tactics work. And these folks have learned that the tactics work, and they've evolved their tactics. The tactics are very effective in this kind of information environment. And so, I'm worried that universities will get so defensive that the chilling effect will happen there in the decisions they're making, which is why something like this is so important, is to let universities know there are ways to help protect your research. You don't have to agree with everything the researcher says. I don't need the university to say everything I say is right or wrong or whatever. You just need the universities to stand behind our right to do these kinds of projects or this kind of research and ask these kinds of questions.
I'm old enough to remember Professor Watch on the internet, right? Like targeting of certain professors that were too progressive or were doing nothing a lot of times. But I wonder if, and this will be a long way of getting into this question, but I wonder if we haven't learned anything. It feels like every single time we're starting from square one, and maybe I'm wrong, and I'd love to be proven wrong. But I'm wondering, it's really interesting to have the two of you here together. This is sort of like a case study. If I were to have the assignment of writing a manual of how an institution might and might not protect their people, you might both factor in prominently for each side. And so I'm just sort of wondering, I guess, what lessons have you learned, and what tips or lessons do you hope that institutions have learned about how to protect their people?
I can say, I think, so I'm at the University of Washington, and I would just say, like, they've just done an amazing job of stepping up to protect me, my colleagues, and that actually are thinking about using some of the stuff that we've gone through as examples to help other researchers, whether that's on the communication side, on how to deal with a hostile inquiry or a hostile request for testimony in Congress, or we're a public records state, probably one of the most liberal laws around public records in the country in Washington State. And so that's been another dimension of what's happened to us. It's like some of these Substack salesmen have read my emails, probably more of my emails than I have. And so the university's learning. They're certainly not going to be able to change the laws around public records, but how do they help support? One of the things for me that the tax was not on, oh God, it's painful to have these out, but actually, apparently, I'm just a robot in my emails, and there's not much
I've
there.
read them. They're very boring.
They said I did.
And professional.
The emails just don't say what they think they're going to say, but I don't even do any off-color jokes or things. I'm very boring in my emails. But but it's still a hassle to go through all of these things and figure out which are responsive to which. And the only time I would cry was when I was thinking about the 42 public records requests we had. And the university stepped up. You know, I just said, here's my computer, and they took my computer and they figured out how to do it, and then they come back to me and they've redacted everything, and then I have a comms team look through it in case there's something I need to be proactive about. Really, they haven't found anything. They told me the only thing that I'm guilty of is being too responsive to people that probably don't deserve my time. It's like, you're way too nice to random people that send you emails. But that kind of thing can be a real tax. And so seeing the university figure out how they can help support researchers and also helping them realize that it wasn't just going to be me has been great. And then also the thing that I learned that was most important early on, it didn't happen all at once. Like, you know, universities are slow, they move slowly, and even though we had pretty good rapport in the university, they weren't going to change big things for one group. But having the chair of my department, the dean of the I school, which we were working with, the dean of the law school, who we were working with, step up and be advocating within the university was super, super, super important. And this was everything around, like, who's going to work with me when I go to a congressional interview, how are we going to pay for that? The law stuff was, the lawsuits were covered in a slightly different way, but like, how are we going to have support around that, support around the public record stuff, and just to have these, the folks that were in the direct, you know, sort of the mid-level folks within the university to be stepping up for their researchers was super important. I will also say that I would just dripping in privilege in my university, and I know that other researchers are not. I had tenure, I was about to go up for full professor, I had other job offers, I could negotiate things, and so I do want to recognize that universities might be moving for me in a way that they wouldn't have moved for others, and so it's important for, I think, everybody here to realize that we need to be doing what the things that I got need to happen for junior researchers as well, and how do we make sure that that happens?
My experience was interesting. So I'm not at Stanford, everybody knows that, and it became a subject of like Platformer and then the Washington Post. That's always a weird story when you're like, all right, using the quiet quitting metaphor, we were kind of internally joking around about being quiet fired, and you're like, that's gonna become a news story, that's gonna be great. So part of the reason that several of us were not renewed was funding, right? But there was also an active decision, a very deliberate decision to move away from conducting certain types of research, including rapid response research, including into election narratives and things like that. So Stanford decided that it was not going to do anything in that capacity in 2024. SIO was not, and it was unclear whether or not SIO was going to continue to exist. And I think they had not figured that out when after my contract ended in June, several other people's who were not renewed in June, same situation. And so since they didn't know what they were doing, they didn't have a plan to communicate about it, including to us. And for me, this was more of a continuation of a problem with not having a plan for communicating about anything, going back a year by that point. So it was not, unfortunately, a surprise, but it was very reflective of paralysis and a bias towards inaction, right? If you say nothing, nobody can yell at you for saying the wrong thing. And if you do nothing, well, maybe like, people can argue about, what would have happened if you had done something. But again, that bias towards inaction, I think, is unfortunately quite easy for institutions. And I really felt it acutely in the context of, just feeling like there was a misalignment on like having a plan that was proactive about anything. When I said, for example, everything that we turn over is going to be leaked, I think we all need to understand that. That is what this is about, right? Everything we're turning over is going to go out to the public, and any testimony that people give is going to be used in that capacity, like 2 sentences here, 2 sentences there. And I just want to make sure everybody's like fully aware of like what's actually going to happen. And then when that leak happened, there was some surprise about it, and I just thought, how is there surprise about this? Like this was the most obvious thing. It actually is shocking to me that nothing, and then I felt like nothing I said got through. And that was the part where I just thought like, oh boy, all right. Again, the nice thing was I was writing a book, right? So I was like, well, I can tell this story. Because I think it's actually like, it's the cautionary tale. It is again, when the climate science people were like, this is what is going to happen to you, I was like, now it's my turn. This is going to happen to you. And so it was very important to me to write it not from a negative or bitter or angry standpoint, but just from you must change your strategic alignment. You must see the comms fight as important as the legal fight. You must understand what the battle that you're actually in is really about. And most importantly, perhaps, you have to understand that the people who have skin in the game should, in fact, have some, I would argue, higher weight in determining how they are going to be communicated about and when. And that was the other piece that I found quite frustrating. I made the decision at one point to just drop my emails with a man who had lied about me and smeared me and gone on Joe Rogan to do it. And I said, this is insane. I'm going to put here's what I actually was saying to him as a source for 3 months. Here's how he then represented those comments. I'm not going to let that go. And it was this sort of funny dynamic of like, well, it's not in the Washington Post. I'm like, it's on Joe Rogan. Come on, 12 million listeners, guys, And I just felt like I was like, again, I think a lot of comms professionals in particular think in terms of like, there is a media cycle and you manage the media cycle. And if it's not in certain outlets, then you don't have to manage it. You can just let it go and it's gonna move on and go to the next thing. And much like Kate, I also found myself saying, like, they've created a cinematic universe. We're characters, we're recurring villains. I was like, think about Marvel. Same people are in all, the same characters are in all the movies. They just like move them around and reference them again and restructure the plot. But like, that's how you have to be thinking about this. And so for me, that point of how can I make that clearer so that the next institution that has this experience thinks about it in the context of how public opinion is shaped on the internet, how influence moves on the internet, and how these very divergent realities have real impact in the real world, particularly for the targets.
Can I add something to that? I think that's a great point. I will say I think something that UW did differently, University of Washington did differently, was early on prior to this happening, they had actually asked us when something was going on. They're like, oh, so-and-so just had this media thing. How do we respond? Because they thought we were the experts. And here we were asking them what to do. And they just actually, the center that I had co-founded, I was then the director of, we had our own comms person. And the university was like, if you have questions, you can ask us, but we trust you to make your decisions. And so we didn't have to go and have the university behind every decision we made. They stood up for us every once in a while when they needed to, but they kind of gave us that independence and kind of trusted our instincts on that. And we tried out different things. I don't think once you're in the spider's web, no matter how you try to fight back, it just wraps itself further and further around you. But we, it felt good to be able to try to do things. But a part of that was because the university gave us, they were like, we support you, and also we want you to make those decisions. And they also allowed us to get some outside help as well, which was good.
I follow you on Blue Sky, and I was amused and interested and just curious because you would tweet or skeet. You would skeet, all right, I'm going to give this a try. And you would lay out, what the rumor and the fake thing was going on, and then you would sort of try a new approach. Sometimes it was a little scorched earth for the very polite Kate Starbird, and sometimes it was you would just try out different things. Did you come away with any lessons from that? Have you learned anything?
We tried out something with the public records request. So one of the things that we always knew, and was probably another reason that we fought back early on, is we knew that tens of thousands of our email and any number of different communication channels were eventually going to go into the hands of people that are not good faith journalists, and we're going to use those in different kinds of ways. And so as those were going out, having not seen them all, I mean, it's not just me, it's all my colleagues, and I haven't even seen it. I don't have time to read all my emails over and over again. Having not even seen them all, we were trying to prepare, like, what would the strategy be? And we had this idea that from the climate scientists that, if they're going to go out, you might as well put the stuff out in advance, give it context and other kinds of things. And so we experimented with that for a little while, and then I just got exhausted. I was like, I don't have time for this. I don't need to read my emails over and over again. And so we kind of got away from it, in part because there's just nothing there, and so they weren't really landing. And so far we haven't seen anything worth really responding to, although we have a space for that if we need to. But yeah, I mean, there's also like a when dealt lemons, make some lemonade. We're researchers on this. Might as well use the opportunity to learn something. At some point, I'll write my book. It will look different than Renee's. It'll be from further away and looking back. But yeah, just trying to at least make something useful out of being in this horrible situation for a while. And so, yeah, we've experimented a little bit. I mean, we're scientists, right? We're not going to just sit back and watch it happen. You gotta tweak it, see what works and what doesn't work. Although it's very small n, so I can't really extrapolate to make big no big conclusions from my experiments so far.
Okay. I think we're going to open it up to some questions. Just as a reminder, the mic's in the middle. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so if you have one, if you could be succinct, that would be really helpful. We can get to as many as possible. And questions under the question mark.
Questions?
Hello. Hi. Congratulations. It would be a shame not to bring out a question. First, thanks for sharing your important work. It seems like this has multiple effects, ripple effects far beyond just the scientific community. Yeah. It's in the media. I'm hearing from funders that they're not allowed to fund programs related to misinformation. Like what happened to you both and the centers is having a really profound impact on what we're allowed to study. And you mentioned earlier also like the professor's web. So now we know, you can't study Palestine, that's been for a while. You can't study disinformation or misinformation now. Like entire areas seem to now be off limits. How, and I wanted to know a little bit between the funding issue, because I think that's really critical. And if you think about like what happened to Joan Donovan, how do you see the link between funding of higher education institutions, the support that you did or didn't get, the possibility of maintaining independent research agendas, and what can you do about it? Because and correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't one of the reasons that they have, that they can make those public records requests is because you receive government funding? And then, sorry, last part of that question, is that not accurate?
No.
Okay.
Anybody can get my emails just by writing
because you're a public university, but not Stanford, right?
Not Stanford, no.
So then my question also is just to extrapolate, because you had this situation for journalists covering disinformation for many years as well, and now there's this whole move to like fund journalism through government funding. So do you see, what do you think the link between increasing government funding in, various areas of information and research have on our ability to continue to do, research at the cutting edge of controversial issues?
Certainly one of the motivations for attacking us and the kind of work we do in the field at large. We are not the only researchers that were pulled in to these articles or the harassment or the congressional investigations. And so, and certainly the tactic or the motivation in part was to get researchers not to do this work, and part of that is through funding. Some of it is my transcript should be available now. I wasn't allowed to talk about my interview for a while, but my transcript is available because they leaked parts of it and then we forced them to put it all out. But the only question that Jim Jordan actually asked me in my interview was about my funding from the National Science Foundation, which I've been getting since I was a PhD student, and I've had sort of consistently over the years for work on rumors and then disinformation. I interpret it as a threat. I'm not sure how he meant it, but certainly that was part of their motivation for looking at this as a congressional committee. It was to think about how to potentially move funding away from this field. And we're feeling that not just with the public funding or government funding, but from others as well. That being said, I don't think it is as dire as maybe some of the newspaper articles would have said a few months ago or a year ago. Certainly we've had funders that have come back that have given us funding in the past or giving us funding again. We've had good signals of some potential new funders in the space. And so I actually don't think that funders are abandoning this space. I think they understand that these questions are hard. I think funders are trying to figure out, like, how is understanding this problem going to help lead to solutions? I don't know if there's a clear connection to that right now in their minds, but I don't actually see it being so dire, even though, yes, we definitely have seen some retraction of funding in the field, and we can say that's probably related to some of these attacks on research and these attempts to politicize the work.
SIO actually had very little government funding, and I just want to raise that as an interesting point. The only government funding we had was about $750,000 as part of a joint grant with UW. And the reason I mention that is because it didn't, they didn't save us, you know.
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter, exactly. They worked so hard to try to come up with some sort of government nexus angle for us that even though we didn't have government funding until it was dispersed in like 2022, so 2 years after the projects they were upset about, where they went with us instead was like alleging that we were ourselves de facto agents of the United States government. This was where this weird conspiracy theory that I was secretly a CIA agent planted at Stanford came from. Because when there is no government nexus, they just try to make one up. So there you have it.
Our funding was the National Science Foundation. Like,
right, it was NSF.
They profoundly don't understand. Like, you write these grants, it's not like, somebody at the White House making decisions. These are like, other researchers rating your grants and passing it up to program officers. It's just, it's not what they make it seem. But certainly, they have the power at Congress to turn dials at the National Science Foundation. We've seen that around research on just politics and politics online, where we wouldn't fund those for a while, and we can see what happened there. And so we know that they can turn those dials, and I think that that's part of what their strategy was.
Thank you both. This has been a wonderful panel. Until recently, I was at the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which has also received its own fair share of pressure for the research it does. So I know the pressure is real from my time there. I've been thinking a lot lately about the liar's dividend, and how just we're part of this. I think this is a microcosm of like a broader downward spiral of declining trust in American society today. And I think I see this kind of project as resurrecting that trust, and fighting back against efforts to keep us going further down because some people benefit from it. I wanted to ask you, like, based on your experiences, like, where do we go from here? Like, how do we get back up? Like, how do we build more trust? How do we build the incentives so that institutions stand behind their researchers, which has been a theme of this conversation. I just wanted to talk about, like, how do we get out of this doom loop? Yeah.
It's all vibes, right? It's gotta, I mean, at some point you hit the bottom and start coming up. And I do think, it's going to be a series of small decisions by a lot of different people. It's hard to say it's going to be one thing. We're going to pull that one piece and everything's going to fall into place. No, it's going to be a lot of different people, whether it's like, you're the chair of a department, or you're a researcher who decides, yeah, I'm going to do that project, or a funder decides, no, we're going to fight and we're going to actually fund this project because it matters. I think it's going to be a lot of small decisions by a lot of people in terms of building, the trust back in the research and the ways that it's covered. And just this article today you sent me of someone who's maybe a sort of right conservative blogger,
like a center-right person.
Yeah, who kind of went back and looked at all these things and like, this is these are false claims against these folks. I think it's going to be a little bit of that, and it's going to be changes in our technical environment that are happening. I think will people are moving to different platforms, and yeah, there's some very, very toxic one, but that doesn't mean we have to stay there forever. And slowly people are taking their time and their eyeballs into other environments. And so I really do think it's a little bit of building things back. And I'm just really hopeful that a lot of people become kind of fed up and even bored with just the conspiracy. At a certain point, the conspiracy theories are going to get boring, and I think it's going to get uncool, and there's going to be some backing away from it. So I'm a systems thinker, and complexity. There's not like one little thing, but that means that a lot of little things are going to help, and so it means that if you're doing work in this area, you don't have to solve the whole problem. You just have to help a little bit. So keep that work up, and I'm hopeful. I'm not confident, but I'm hopeful.
Yeah, I'm doing a bunch of work on counter-speech facilitation, on middleware, agency and design. There's a lot of different fields where, again, from a systems perspective, what are different levers that you have to bridging algorithms, like ways to bring trust back and to kind of, I would say, shift some of the dynamics that exacerbate the problems and exacerbate the distrust. So, will they be successful? I don't know, but a research agenda for the next couple of years.
I bet we can do 2 more questions if we go really quickly.
Try to go
Okay.
fast.
Okay.
So first, just as a data point, I was a grad student at Stanford and decided to do research on health misinformation at the University of Washington at the Center for the Informed Public after seeing the differences in the 2 institutions' approaches, and I went where I felt like I would be best protected. I wanted to ask you for your thoughts on the ways that the premise of academic freedom has been distorted and sort of co-opted to advance these types of attacks.
I felt like I really didn't understand what academic freedom was or who it applied to, and that's my very, very candid response. I really just thought it was something that came from doing research. I did not understand that it was sort of like conferred. I still do not fully understand all of the details, candidly. Maybe that sounds very naive, but I came in sort of through the side door. One of the things Stanford centers do is they pull people who are not traditional academics, and so I just sort of assumed, and it was a bit of a wake-up call. So you maybe have a better answer here. I do find that in conversations with people who have reached out since all the drama with Stanford happened, I've had very interesting conversations with people with institutions who are like, how can we actually help clarify this? How can we ensure that this does apply? How can we make sure that these sorts of things don't happen? And so I've been heartened by that, even while feeling like I was stupidly naive to not ever have asked the question, because it just didn't occur to me as a thing I had to ask.
I don't think I ever spoke the words academic freedom and even recognized that as something, we talk about it as something that matters or whatever, but I was studying rumors online, looking at why would this ever apply to me, until all of a sudden it does, because the work begins to focus on something that's politicized and becomes hard to do. I don't know if I have a great answer in kind of it's so hard to account for bad faith criticisms of what things are, and things that kind of distort what things mean, and at a certain point, I feel like you're never going to win by trying to defend against those kinds of things. You have to just, create and strengthen the frames of what academic freedom is and and why it matters and why it's important. And spending all of our time dealing with these bad faith twists of the truth, whether it's putting out fact checks of everything or dealing with this kind of argument that you're talking about, I think it's just really important to say why it matters, explain why it matters and what it is, which is I think what we're doing here, and I think that's great.
So I'll be quick. I'm Evie Downey, Associate Dean for Research in the College of Arts and Sciences here. I want to see all of our faculty feeling comfortable that they can pursue this kind of research and be impactful. But when I hear this, I think of emergency planning, right? We plan for fires, we plan for what to do if there's a pandemic. Is this something for which it would be useful for the university to take the relevant stakeholders, sit down together and have an emergency management plan way before it happens, that's going to listen and be responsive to the needs of the researchers attacked, but is going to have all of our resources ready to go and have learned from the ones that have happened before? Or is each situation so unique that it needs to be handled completely differently? Would that be a helpful thing to do? Or could it damage and make people feel even less comfortable about doing that kind of research?
I think in general, what you're proposing here of sort of like a university kind of thinking about what their resources are for a researcher or a faculty member or a student who gets caught up in one of these things, independent of domain or context, right? Whether that's in climate or disinformation or gender or conflict or something else that's happening, right? So I think it's really, I do think it's valuable for the university to think about, okay, what would happen if researcher A is requested to go to a congressional hearing and what do? Or certain sort of partisan media outlets start to run articles. Like where is the boundary of like, oh, we don't respond, here we start to respond. Like kind of going through some of those scenarios as sort of a crisis planning exercise would not be bad, and kind of getting a sense of like who would be there, who would be the outreach to the researcher. And sometimes it's just like having another faculty member to go talk to who's more senior, who can just like say it's going to be okay, we're going to support you. It's going to go a long way for those first weeks of just reeling about it and not knowing who to talk to. So I absolutely think it's something that universities should be thinking about.
I would plus one that. I've spent a bunch of time with business leaders actually over the last 2 years, including when I was researching the book and then for some work I have coming out. And this is such a standard thing for business to do, right? Which is just considered part of your sort of like crisis plan. Like there's a, do they do it well? Not always, right? But I remember watching Starbucks. Do you remember? And like, God, this would have been 2015 or something, where like 4chan did some, like some shenanigans after there was an incident where 2 black men were asked to leave. This was like a real sort of racist incident that happened, but then there was like the internet came in and did its thing, and the whole 4chan got involved, and it was a mess for Starbucks. And that, I think, was one of these first pivotal moments where brands began to realize that an online rumor could have profound impact. I think about this sometimes in the context of like Procter & Gamble and some of the like canonical literature of, this like rumors coming for brands like, 20 years ago or 40 years ago now, God, the 80s. I'm old. But it is this like, you start to see that question of like, what is the crisis plan that you have in place? Not because you need it, but just because you at least have like a groundwork understanding of, understanding what a media cycle looks like in this era and when to respond.
I want to build off of that because it reminds me of this one pivotal moment we had in the spring of 2023. And I've got the chair of my department, dean of the iSchool, and a couple other folks were like, what are we going to do? How are we going to get help? And they're like, well, when the CEOs of the tech companies get pulled in front of these hearings, who do they go to? And so we start going through our Rolodex to try to figure out what happens here and how to. Fortunately, we were able to find someone within the university, but like the universities should be thinking about that. Historically, the University of Washington would send in our federal relations person, and that's not in this environment probably the right person to be sending in. You want somebody who's actually got. You want to think a little bit like a corporation or someone of like, how do you make sure that you're you've got the expertise to train us into managing those kinds of situations. So whether it's those kinds of things or media or something else, like figuring out what your resources are and where you'll go. These things happen fast. Like when they call you to go to a congressional interview, like you got like weeks, like 2 or 3 weeks maybe was what they gave me initially. And so you've got to really have those plans in place prior in order to support researchers who will inevitably be called in.
And any of those plans are going to indefinitely, they're going to rely on the research that you've done to sort of show the pathways that these things take. And the characters may change, but the stories remain so similar. So we have a lot to work with to make those plans and go forward. And I thank you both for telling your personal stories and for the research that you do. So if you could thank with me, Renee Dreska and Dr. Kate Steiberg. And I'm going to invite Dr. Trumbull back to the stage.
Thank you so much. We're going to do a bit of a quick set change here, have another chair come up, and I will take this opportunity to share with you a little bit more about the Researcher Support Consortium. Before I do that, though, I just want to take a second to reflect on the courage that it took for Renee and Kate to join us here today and to tell their stories. Absolutely. Thank you. as we began planning for this event, we reached out to a number of different researchers across fields. In fact, while this discussion was going on, I got a handful of emails from colleagues saying, we're watching the live stream, are you aware of this incident and this other incident in all of these different fields? Part of the reason, and their conversation today really reflected this, part of the reason that it is relatively a bit safer for people like Renee and Kate to talk about this is because they study the very phenomenon that's being turned on them in these instances. And so they understand it very deeply and are more comfortable reflecting on it. But I don't want anyone here to leave with the impression that it is only this field and that Kate and Renee, what they speak of is really narrowly defined. The sort of patterns and the tactics that they described are well worn. As many of us who study these things reflect on this, we refer to the playbook that's involved here. And it is imperative that we all become, and especially our institutions, become more familiar with what that means, with what the playbook is, and the larger impacts that it can have across disciplines. And so that's really what brings us to today, to the launch of the Researcher Support Consortium. In the work that Professor Searles and I have done, we focused in sort of two different ways on this problem. We have done a lot of research to understand the tactics, the impacts on our colleagues, but most importantly, the solutions. And there we focused first on how do we provide sort of rapid response crisis support when someone's in the midst of a campaign and when they're being targeted. But the second is how do we better prepare in advance, and particularly how do we get institutions to step up? And you'll note when you see the screen capture here from our website, researchersupport.org, that our focus is on funders and on institutions, and primarily when we speak of institutions, we talk about universities, colleges, institutions of higher ed, to some degree professional associations as well. But we're not going to address this problem without those institutions stepping up. So what I'm going to do now is walk you through just a few highlights from the Researcher Support Consortium. It's essentially a clearinghouse for resources and best practices for those institutions that are interested in figuring out how to better provide support and protection for the colleagues who are doing this incredibly important work. So, wanted to just highlight, I don't expect anyone to read this text, although if you're pulling out your phones and following along online, you can actually look at the website live. We begin, of course, with a focus on the problem and helping people really understand what's at stake here, what's happening, what those tactics, what the playbook actually is, and what the impacts are for people. What we really emphasize in this work is that campaigns of intimidation and harassment directed at researchers are an occupational hazard. It is the important work that our colleagues do that puts them at risk. And as such, it means that their employers, those who fund the work in the first place, actually have a fundamental responsibility to step in and provide this form of support. I wanted to highlight for you just a few of the sort of key elements that we focus on when we describe the problem. We list things like provide a bunch of additional information in these different categories, so starting with attacker types, as well as attack types, and for each of these instances where we describe a different type of attack, we provide a case study so that we can see again across different disciplines how this unfolds. We focus on the various attack themes, who's impacted, and in fact what those impacts are. And I think it's worth pausing here for just 1 second to note that there are all sorts of impacts at all sorts of levels. There are psychological impacts. There are impacts on the work itself. There are impacts on the institutions, right? Here we have a note about talent drain and so on. This is a much larger problem than it's often framed as. We do provide resources for researchers themselves, but again, our focus is on the institutions. We know that it is important for researchers to be able to find what resources are out there. Luckily, there are quite a few, and so we've tried to compile a number of those that researchers can take a look at here. So I'll give you a couple of quick highlights there. One of the things that we've found is most important in our work is that scholars, researchers don't know how to ask for help, right? How do they talk about this problem with their institutional representatives, with a department chair, with an associate dean for research, with a dean, right? Anyone within their sort of chain of command, how is it they approach this conversation? And so we actually provide concrete guidance that we've researched best practices here about how to go about this. But then we also compile a number of other resources that we've drawn on in our work and that are available to researchers at any time. So including tools and support to take action, and information and advice to read up on and help prepare in advance. But now I really want to focus on what's the heart and soul of the Researcher Support Consortium. The work that we think is most important in this space is we've created an actual toolkit for institutions. Evie, you stood up and asked the question that I promise you we did not set that up, but I am so grateful that you asked that question because now I know I have the opening with my own Associate Dean for Research to have a conversation about how to implement this toolkit that we've offered. Let me dive just a little bit into the toolkit itself. We definitely don't have time. I want you to hear from the incredible panel that we have coming next. But I wanted to give a few highlights for you so you can understand what this is all about. And as you note here, we've essentially categorized this into 3 different buckets. Setting up to deal with this. So how is it crucially you bring those different actors around the universities together? What sort of policies do you need and so on? Proactive measures and responding to an incident. And I'll give you a few highlights from each of these. So setting up is particularly important. Under this, we have 3 separate categories: preparing for attacks, sample policy, and we talk about a mechanism called certificates of confidentiality, which apply to researchers who are doing human subjects work and can actually apply to NIH to protect their research data even from subpoenas. But in any case, that preparing for attacks component, I'm not going to show you everything that's under there, but this is really important because this is where we give a step-by-step. There are 14 points here, right? And each one of them has more drop-down with really specific information. It's step-by-step guidance, right? We don't want to leave the institutions in the dark about how to do this, so we really try to be clear and thorough throughout. And I wanted to highlight for you that we have things like sample policies. We actually give example language. This isn't language that's going to fit, that's going to work for every single institution, but it's a really good starting point for, I think, the vast majority of institutions. We've drawn on existing language that other institutions do have in place, though there are very, very few out there, and built on that through various conversations. If we turn to proactive measures, you notice that there's a focus here on creating a research support team. So this is really going into detail about what are the different offices, divisions that tend to be around universities and colleges, where you might draw expertise to the table and start having discussions, right? That planning, that emergency preparedness essentially ready in advance. We talk about communication strategies. Brandy and Kate did a really wonderful job of highlighting just how essential communication is. And it's not just external communication about the attacks, but it's internal communication. One of the things that is absolutely most important that has come out so clearly in Katie and my research is that some of the most significant negative impacts come because people feel profoundly isolated in these moments. And they feel isolated because people aren't talking to them. Their colleagues, right, maybe don't know how to, feel uncomfortable, sort of back away, are worried that they might be pulled into things. But also their institutional representatives aren't talking to them. They're making plans, they're talking to one another, but they're not effectively communicating with the researchers who are being impacted. So we really pay careful attention to guidance that's needed for institutions to do a better job of including the impacted scholars in those conversations. And then we have some guidance on the legal issues and public records requests, which Kate reflected on so well earlier. And last but not least, we have some guidelines and advice for responding to an incident when it comes, because you can be as prepared as possible, but preparedness does not prevent in many of these instances. And so we provide things like the reporting form template and lay out a number of response procedures. I really want to highlight, right, underscore just one last time before I welcome the last panel on, that this is an issue that is not just about the individual researchers themselves and how they're being impacted. And you know, as we say, this is an occupational hazard, and so our universities have a responsibility to step up, but they also have the incentive to step up because these attacks are about undermining the institutions themselves. They're about undermining the confidence in higher education, about undermining trust in science, scientific inquiry, expertise, and knowledge. Our universities are the centers of learning and knowledge production. And if our institutions do not do a better job of protecting researchers going forward, I really have profound worries, profound concerns about what the landscape looks like in the next 10 to 20 years. So I'm grateful for everyone who's come today, who's joining us on the live stream, that we're having these conversations. And we get to continue now with an incredible panel of really thoughtful legal eagles, primarily, who are going to be sharing their insights a bit from personal experience and supporting researchers, and help us think through a bit more of the larger landscape, take a bit of the higher view, larger perspective on this. So with that, I'd like to welcome Brandy and our next panelist back to the stage. Thank you.
Hello again. So I'm really excited about this panel because it gives us a chance to, like Dr. Trumbull said, zoom out and talk about freedom, right? Freedom from harassment, freedom, academic freedom, freedom of speech, a term that gets lobbed around a lot and somehow the meaning totally lost at the same time. So I'm really happy to have, I'll just start here. We'll start with Will Creeley. He is the legal director for the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And then we have Marianne Franks. She is the Eugene L. and Barbara A. Bernard Professor of Intellectual Property Technology and Civil Rights Law at George Washington University Law School. She's also the president of Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, a nonprofit dedicated to combating online abuse and discrimination. And then, of course, we have Alex Abdo. He's the litigation director for the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. So welcome them with me, won't you? So feel free to just to take it whenever you want it, but we've seen from the ground, right, with Kate and Renee. What are you guys seeing from your view a little higher up?
Well, I'll jump in. Thanks for having me. So I was listening to Kate and Renee and talking to Marianne and Alex backstage. I really want to underscore that this is an old story. Working for FIRE, I've defended student and faculty rights since 2006. And I remember writing a letter to then Virginia Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli when he brought a civil investigation under a Virginia Anti-Fraud, Anti-Taxpayer Fraud Act against Michael Mann. And that was early on. And I remember talking to professors, getting a phone call while I'm sitting down eating dinner with my family and talking to a professor who was at a targeted end of one of these efforts, who was frankly suicidal. I've seen the impact that this can have on folks. And there's so many things to say here, but I'll keep it brief because I want to hear my co-panelists. But two quick practical thoughts. We have been pushing model legislation that would protect faculty at public universities, including researchers, I'm using that word researchers fairly broadly, from intrusive open records requests that seek to get at their personal correspondence, their research, in ways that I think, while there is an arguable open government interest, in ways that I think clearly conflict with our national commitment to academic freedom, which is an admittedly gauzy term. I saw Renee and Kate have much the same reaction that we sometimes have at FIRE, which is what exactly does it mean and where does it attach? But that is one concrete step that would protect researchers from that kind of intrusive fishing expedition type inquiry. And the other thing I just want to plug right away is our Faculty Legal Defense Fund. If a public university researcher is targeted and censored or the victim of intrusive inquiries like this, we will provide them with legal counsel for 40 hours and then perhaps with litigation afterwards. So I want to put that out there now. And with that, I will be quiet.
So some of the things that we're seeing, and this is to echo the idea that this has been around for some time and that it's not a coincidence that the two of the researchers you heard from before they're both women. We've noticed that this kind of attack often has a gender dimension. It also has a racial dimension in many cases. And so vulnerable people and many, vulnerable identities, generally speaking, are going to be the people targeted for these kinds of attacks even more so than everyone else. And these kinds of attacks, especially when they're on either women or sexual minorities, will also often have a sexual exploitation angle. So in addition to the death threats, you're also going to be looking at rape threats. You're looking at sexual exploitation using someone's private images, or now with new technologies, the creation of intimate images that actually didn't exist. So there's a lot of concerns that are added on to that kind of harassment and the kind of dimensions it can take on when we're speaking of that gendered kind of harassment. The couple other things I would mention is that we're seeing too that the First Amendment, this free speech discourse that we have in our country, I think if we haven't noticed this before, we should certainly be paying attention to it now, that the First Amendment is not the answer here, right? The First Amendment is oftentimes actually in some ways being deployed as a means, as a justification for these attacks. So you have congressional hearings, you have public discourse talking about how misinformation researchers or people who are doing certain kinds of work, they're being portrayed as censors. And the kinds of attacks on them, the lawsuits, the pressure, the intimidation, that's all being justified as a basis for saying, well, because they're trying to censor conservatives, right, this old myth that has been around for some time, they deserve this because they are the censors and we are the ones who are defending the First Amendment and free speech. So there's that extra level of irony that there's so much misinformation about what the First Amendment actually is. So there's partly that there's genuine public confusion over what the First Amendment means. And then there's also combined with that the very cynical deployment of the First Amendment to do what the First Amendment can do sometimes, which is overprotect the kind of speech that is harassing, intimidating, and silencing other people, and underprotecting the kind of speech that actually pushes back against power structures and actually does something revolutionary. So I think we need to understand the limitations and the misuses of the First Amendment when we're discussing this. We also have to situate all of this in the context of a larger attack on higher education as an institution. So this is something that is not absolutely new in our country. There are waves of this, right? Every time there's a kind of radicalization among university communities, we see the pushback. But there's definitely a whole process here that was set up, right? That a few years ago, there was the kind of conservative, libertarian, liberal kind of idea that students are snowflakes and they're not really responding to just uncomfortable ideas. And the uncomfortable ideas, if you scratch the surface, were usually things like racist and sexist ideas that they found were uncomfortable, white supremacists coming to their campuses, things like that students didn't really love. And so there was this vilification going on at that time under the guise of free speech, academic freedom, the First Amendment, saying they need to be more uncomfortable with these kinds of controversial ideas. And then as soon as some of the ideas became different, right, let's say, for instance, a pro-Palestine protest, suddenly it shifts, right, to say, actually, there are some ideas that are just too uncomfortable that people should be shielded from. And that was also the line for critical race theory. That's also the diversity line. That's also learning about the truth about slavery. That's just too uncomfortable. So it's a very malleable discourse that we have to be really careful about. But when you propagandize that way, when you portray students as both being somehow incredibly fragile, but also somehow dangerous, that's how we get to the situation we're in now, where you're seeing so much vilification, open vilification of students and faculty members. The professors are the enemy, right? So we really need to understand that this is a part of a larger movement to discredit academic freedom generally, to discredit higher education generally, to push back on the idea of critical inquiry. That is something that is, it's a nationwide phenomenon that we're in the midst of right now. And so the stakes are really high. The chilling effect is all across the university. It's all across every university. The kinds of things you're allowed to talk about, allowed to research, allowed to publish on, and the fact that you've got so many government actors who are willing to really just set academics up, right? These McCarthy-esque hearings where they're calling university presidents before them and demanding certain types of claims or justifications or promises from them under the threat, right? Not to say, let's have a conversation and tell us more, but we may take away your funding or something else might happen to you. The very same politicians who are saying there's collusion between the Biden administration and social media companies and private individuals. Right? If collusion means something, it surely means when members of Congress are saying, we're going to take away your funding or threaten to do something else to you if you don't produce the ideologies that we think are important, or if you explore the questions that we think you shouldn't be exploring. So everything's a little backwards here, and that we have to do a lot of untangling to try to figure out how the First Amendment is being used, how free speech is being weaponized, and how all of this is becoming politicized in a way that is really not just about individual researchers, of course, but about a chilling effect on the academy, which means a chilling effect on democracy.
Let me just add a couple of thoughts. It's great to be here. At the Knight Institute, we spend a lot of time advising researchers who are coming under these sorts of threats, and so we have a little bit of advantage from probably the last 7 years of providing this kind of advice. And what I've noticed, what is kind of inescapable is the fact that our legal system is being abused in an effort to stifle constitutionally protected research. And the unfortunate reality is that our legal system is not built in a way that is makes it easy to provide an answer to these sorts of abuses or to prevent its abuse in this way. If you are somebody, a legislator or a state law enforcement officer who has the authority to launch an investigation and issue investigative demands or subpoenas, it is very easy to come up with a pretense for the exercise of that authority, but to target it at people who have views you disagree with or who are engaged in research you want not to happen. If you are, say, the world's richest man, it is easy to fund a lawsuit that, while frivolous on the merits, is dressed up in the language of law and so seemingly plausible to the average court observer, and in so doing impose extraordinary costs on people to have to defend themselves against that legal threat. And even if you have none of those privileges, you don't have that investigative authority, you don't have the power, the money to bankroll a lawsuit, it's very easy in many states to file freedom of information requests with public university professors demanding everything under the sun about their work. And some states have narrower freedom of information laws. They don't have the kind of exceptions that Will's model legislation includes for academic freedom, but many do not. And you've heard a little bit about that. So I think that context is important because I think helps disabuse us of the notion that the law is going to solve this problem. Because at least with the current laws that we have, they don't prevent this sort of misuse, and they allow it. And that means to confront it, we have to do more than just fight on legal terms. And you've heard that repeatedly from people today, that the fight is often in the media. It is one of PR. It is for higher principle. And I think, unfortunately, that's the fight that we have to have. It can't just be one limited to court filings and to legal drafting and the like, because that won't be sufficient in the end to stave off these threats.
We're going to have more time for questions, because one of my questions was, how is the law going to solve this problem? But instead, you guys spend a lot of time talking to researchers, academics, journalists. Thank you. And what tips do you have for them? What do you tell them? What successes have you had? What have you learned in the last couple of years navigating this sort of specific environment that you can share with us?
Yeah, I've got kind of a few. I think the first thing is to make noise, right? I think isolating somebody away from their support networks, whether that's institutional, professional, and likewise, is important. We tell folks to get in touch with us, right? Let your department chair know, let your university know, let your union know. And we can discuss the contours of legal help, but I do think having a lawyer is extremely important. We had a case where we represented a professor at Rutgers University from the left. He had written on his personal Facebook page that in his neighborhood of Harlem, he hated all the white people who were at his favorite burger joint one night when he went to get a burger. When I was writing the letter that we wrote to Rutgers after they found him guilty of racial harassment for this post on his personal Facebook page, I found, to my horror, that the idea of swamping Rutgers with complaints about racial harassment originated on stormfront.org, a Nazi site. And so I wrote, shocking, right? But I wrote to the university. I said, hey, you are being dog walked by neo-Nazis, right? This is not helpful for you. It's a couple clicks for the New York Post. It's a couple clicks for the media outlets on the right that said, left-wing professor hates white people, right? But the result for your institution is a bright flare signal to everybody. And I heard you use the phrase, don't feed the trolls. But this was not only feeding the trolls, but sitting them out at a sumptuous banquet, right? That they had got this result that they were looking for. So what we did in that instance, and I agree that law cannot always be the both sword and shield, but what we did in this instance was to remind the university president of his promises of academic freedom that he had made at a commencement a year before, in addition to 20 pages of law, right? But we also said, President Barchi, surely you understand, just 3 months ago, and happily the decision was reversed. But I say all that to say I think you need a multi-pronged strategy. And one thing we were talking about just before in response to Renee and Kate's comments was to have a plan prior to the crisis, to have a pre-emergency set of protocols or understandings between you and your colleagues and you and your institution so that there is not a momentary scramble when things are hard and the lights are on.
I think there are some ideas that you can rest on. The idea of being prepared, right? I think is one, to think about how this, even if it hasn't happened to you yet, it may just be a matter of time, and so to have some kind of crisis plan in place. But it's really hard to talk about generalizable tips because everyone's situation is going to be so different, and the response to your story may be different depending on factors beyond your control. So for a lot of things that we might say to one particular person who's being targeted, again, if that is someone who happens to be a woman or someone who happens to be a racial minority, you may expect that, in fact, what response you get is going to be, well, what did you do to deserve this? Or, was there something that you actually did to provoke this? And you have to worry about the fact that it's not just going to be above the belt kind of intimidation. It's going to also be a risk of sexual exploitation. If you make a statement, if you're in a video, if there is a picture of you, that can be used against you, and it's really hard to know what are you going to be able to do to defend yourself against that, because I think as both Kate and Renee were saying earlier today, if you say nothing, bad things are going to happen. If you say something, bad things are probably also going to happen, and that you may have to prepare for both of those and try to think about which one's actually worse in the end. So I would say when it comes to some of those specific, especially gendered forms of harassment or sexual exploitation of that kind of harassment, do take a look at the work that my organization does to provide support to victims of image-based sexual abuse, the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, and others that you may need to bring into the fold here. But yes, I think I'm cautious about saying anything because truly you just don't know what's going to happen. And so I guess there's two things I guess I really would rather say, which is, first of all, understand that when you're being attacked in this way, you are not alone, and that also this is an attempt to make you distracted. It is an attempt, on top of terrifying you and on top of trying to intimidate you, it's meant to take up your time. And that doesn't mean that you can't and won't have to spend time to respond, but that is part of the strategy, is to steal your time and to keep you from the important work that you're doing. So be aware that that is part of the tactic here, and rely on the things in your life that are solid and real and bring you comfort and joy, right? And at the same time, understand, and I hate that I have to say this, but that especially when you are a vulnerable person on multiple levels, be aware that not only you, but your family will maybe be attacked, that you have to think about whether you are a swatting risk, that is someone going to make a false claim to law enforcement and show up at your door at your university. You may want to have a conversation with elderly parents whose addresses might be leaked because someone's trying to attack you, that if they can't get you, they'll try to get you through some other way. So this is just a terrifying landscape that people have to navigate, but be aware that these are things that are known. There are people who have been through it, but things are very unpredictable, and that is not your fault.
I love the way that you're saying that, because I think so much of these conversations in the places where they happen, to the people that they happen to, it's the researcher or the journalist, whatever, is the problem, right? Oh, look what you've invited, right? Like you've done something, even if it's not clearly stated like that, you've done something to bring shame upon us, and now we have to deal with that. Instead of saying, this is happening to you, this is a well-worn playbook, there are lots of things that we can do, and giving people agency and empowering them with support to do what's best for them in that situation. It's very heartening to hear. So thank you.
I agree with everything they've said, and I especially agree with what Marianne said, that there's no one playbook for every individual whose life might come under threat, because the circumstances vary. In the conversations I've had with researchers, I have found that most often the three things I say are, one, assume everything that you write, that you have written in personal correspondence, in research notes, et cetera, is going to become public. That risk is especially acute for public university researchers in states with strong freedom of information laws. Two, understand that the fight is not only or even usually legal. It is often a fight over PR and media, and as Marianne is describing, your personal safety, and think carefully through whether you want to engage in those kinds of fights. If so, how you can engage in those fights, and what makes sense for your situation. And finally, and this echoes what everybody today has said, but I'll try to flesh it out in a slightly different way. Prepare as best you can in advance. Understand your legal risks, if those are among your risks. Understand your financial risks and the financial risks of your institution. Get insurance if you can for the work that you do, so that to the extent you are called into court, you can rely upon that insurance to defray the costs. If you have sympathetic reporters, talk to them in advance off the record, so that when a committee in Congress goes after your work publicly, they will be playing a PR game. At least there's a sympathetic reporter who doesn't have to start from scratch and reporting on the story, and knows your side of the story and can write quickly. Have a statement ready to go if it's that sort of fight, where you describe your work and explain the public importance of it. And if you are at a university, and many researchers are not, but if you are at a university, think carefully through your relationship with your university. Oftentimes, researchers' interests will at some point diverge from the interests of their university when it comes to these sorts of fights. You heard some of that conversation, particularly with Renee earlier. But think carefully through that, and whether it makes sense for you to talk in advance to your administration, to talk in advance to the Office of General Counsel at your university, and in particular to talk in advance to the academic side, to your deans and your provost, to make sure that your university sees it as a fight about academic freedom, so that they are prepared to defend your right to engage in the research you're engaging in, and not to get distracted by questions about legal liability and financial risk, which the administration will be focused on, because that is the role of the administration, is to ensure the financial, universities these days are large corporations and they have to ensure their financial solvency, but you want the fight to be one about academic freedom and your right to engage in the work, not about, legal risks and financial risks that your institution faces. So that's the advice that I typically give, but to Marianne's point, every situation is different, and you'll have to, hopefully you'll be able to talk to somebody through your particulars and get some sage advice through this network or other networks.
What about institutions and universities? What should they be doing that they're not necessarily? Feel free to name and shame, or uplift.
Yeah, I mean, grow a spine, right? Have a backbone. Understand that the cost of, just as I was alluding to at Rutgers, and Rutgers did eventually do the right thing, but the institutional and reputational cost of backing down in that moment on that fight not only betrays that individual faculty member, but all faculty, frankly, all staff, because you've invited further attacks. Successful tactics will be repeated. Your students who no longer have the benefit from learning from that professor. I'm thinking in particular, name and shame, of a case we had a few years back at Old Dominion, where a professor, Alan Walker, they, them pronouns, their work centered on pedophilia, and they used the term minor attracted persons in their book. And what do you know? Catnip for a certain demographic, right, on the right. This was one of the times that we've had to consider, I think as I recall the first time that we've had to reconsider personal security detail. Whether we would organizationally be able to help on that in that level. We found them legal representation, but it was a scary as hell couple of days. And in that moment, I think it was Kate who said, when the University of Washington had her back, things changed. And in that moment, that institution had a choice. And it did not pass the test as far as I'm concerned. A settlement was reached. Everybody was safe, thank goodness, but that's a volatile situation. And if you are, to Alex's good point, a gigantic government entity, a very rich and powerful institution, you should act like it, right? I mean, my goodness, what else is the purpose? What else is the point? So think less about PR of the moment and more about long-term reputational and long-term institutional mission. That's my quick advice.
I would agree with that in some respect. The institutional part of, you need to act it, right? So if you want to defend academic freedom, you have to make sure that you as a university, as an institution, are yourself enacting it, which means lots of things like, for instance, trying not to call the cops on your students if they're engaged in peaceful protest, right? There are lots of things that universities should be doing to make sure that they themselves internally are expressing those values of academic freedom and robust exchange of ideas. It also means that you have to understand that things can happen within the community that are going to be hard to navigate. It's not always an external threat versus internal threat. Sometimes, the threats can come from students. They can come from other faculty members. That's hard to navigate, but you have to do that on some level. But then very much that sense of stand up for your community. If you're called before Congress to account for your university, stick up for your university and for the people that you are supposed to represent. It's very scary to be called in front of Congress, and of course donors are going to be saying the things that they're saying, but those are not the people that universities are supposed to be serving first and foremost. They should be defending their communities, defending their practices, not the outcomes, not the conclusions, not the subject matter, the outcomes and the method of critical inquiry and research that higher education is supposed to be about. And so what you don't want to do is to be one of those university officials who's called before Congress and throws your faculty members under the bus. That should be an easy one, right? And try to push back on vilification narratives. Don't let people say things like these students are monsters or these faculty deserve to be in jail. That should be something incumbent upon all higher education institutions to push back on that propaganda, on that attempt to vilify and to dehumanize people who are working within your institution. So in other words, yes, you need to be it needs to be an institutional structural response, not left to the individual. So that tie between your previous question and this one is, it's really almost impossible for an individual to do this on their own. It makes a world of difference if a university is willing to say, before anyone has to come with a crisis, because once you're in crisis, but to say, part of what we offer here as the university is we're aware that universities are under attack, and we have a plan. We know these things could happen at any time. If it happens to you, you will contact us. We will have this plan in place, as opposed to a faculty member, someone coming under fire and then having to scramble, tell the story, be doubted, be victim blamed, all of this, to institutionally say, we know that this is a threat and we are prepared for it, just like we would be prepared for any kind of threat. That is intensely important. But I would also say that as much as we can expand from individual preparation to institutional preparation, some of this is even bigger than any of those things. Sometimes this is going to be the law in a different sense, which is there needs to be more activation of certain laws against harassment and exploitation. Sometimes what you're actually going to need is legislative reform to ensure that these kinds of things can't just happen to people, because it's really just a strange world to be living in, to think you as a professor, someone who is a researcher, has to figure out how they're going to ward off death threats, how they're going to deal with the fact that their home address could be published online, these are things we as a society have to do something more about, because it's not going to be something that any individual or any institution alone is going to be able to really combat effectively.
And I think there are so many examples from our very recent history that show us that capitulation will not save you or your organization, that is not a successful way to respond to this sort of thing. I hope people are learning those lessons.
I'm not sure that this is different, but maybe I'll say it in a slightly different way. If you're a researcher, you shouldn't have to worry about whether the work that your university has hired you to engage in, whether they'll stand up to defend it when it comes under threat. That shouldn't be a concern that a researcher has. And one way I think that universities can alleviate that uncertainty is by articulating their vision of academic freedom and advance. And just one very concrete example of that, a lot of universities have gotten subpoenas or investigative demands in the course of these congressional and state law enforcement investigations. And it seems as though the way that the universities are handling those demands is through some kind of rough political calculus. If we just turn over this person's emails, will we weather the storm because whatever they find is not going to matter for purposes of the university, even if it ends up being an enormous threat of harassment to the individual researcher. What I would like to see is universities articulate a principle about what academic freedom means for the research notes, for example, or of their academics, or the identities of the students who are working on these projects, and articulate in advance where the lines are. We will not turn over records such as these, except in extraordinary circumstances. And you can imagine what those might be, but in the ordinary circumstances, they're just not going to turn them over because they're connected too closely to research that the researchers have an academic freedom right to engage in, and that the First Amendment protects. I would like to see that, and I think articulating the principle in advance will make it easier for universities to stick by it after the fact. Where I think they have gotten into trouble over the last several years, not just last year, but over the last several years, is when they are trying to grapple with the principle after the fact, when they get the demand and then the political calculus shapes the way that they think about the principle. I think that's, they're on their back foot already if that's the way that they are dealing with these issues. They should articulate the principle first and then apply it once the facts arise.
I love that, the idea of a sort of North Star that you figure out first and then guides you. We have 10 minutes for questions. Do you guys want to line up at the mic?
Hi there, and thank you so much for being here. Belle Torek, Senior Fellow of AI and Tech at the Human Rights Campaign. So much of this conversation is necessarily focused on academics at universities, but looking around the room, I see representation from non-university nonprofits like CCDH, CDT, the Center for American Progress, and the Human Rights Campaign. We all engage in research around hot-button topics like mis and disinfo, election integrity, and the like. My question is, to what extent might mitigation strategies differ in the case of research conducted by nonprofits that are not universities?
This is a great question. My mind immediately goes to NAACP v. Alabama, right? Efforts from the government to try and force a private nonprofit with, in that time, politically unpopular mission in Jim Crow, Alabama, to turn over membership rolls. It's a very interesting question. I think that some of the basic nuts and bolts of these mitigation strategies, having a pre-commitment at the highest levels of institutional leadership, knowing what to do when things come under fire, are all transportable. That's my first cut at it. But I rely in some part, I call universities to action and rely in some part on their mighty power that maybe, CCDH and Stanford are different in terms of their institutional abilities. But I think that perhaps maybe the through thread would be a common understanding, to the extent that one is possible, prior to the political wind starting to blow, as to what the internal response will be. What will each organization do from the staff, from the newest hire to the most senior employee? Having a shared understanding before things start getting ugly. That would be my first suggestion, but I'm curious to hear what you folks think.
I mean, I really appreciate the point on two levels, not just on the outside of the higher education context, but also even if we're just staying with higher education for a moment, we're talking about adjuncts. If we're talking about contract workers, we're talking about community colleges, we're talking about institutions that just don't either have the resources or people whose positions are very precarious there. A lot of these protections are just not going to be accessible or realistic in so many ways. So I just want to mark, I don't have a good answer for that, but to say these are really, it's to underscore the limitation of these, of the sort of privileges some of us might have that accrue at these higher education institutions that have money and offer job security. And that, I think, does shed some light on the question of nonprofits too, because one would hope that any nonprofit with resources would be able to do exactly as you're suggesting and have this vision in mind of, we need to protect our researchers, protect the people who work here and plan for these kinds of attacks. What I think of immediately of organizations like mine, and I'm sure many others that are represented here, you barely have enough money to keep the lights on, right? So where are you also going to find money for insurance or for training or for keeping your staff safe? And I don't really know what the answer to that really is, especially when we're getting to a point where there's so much scrutiny of federal funding and other types of funding to try to drain some of these organizations that are doing great work so they have even less money than usual. So again, I think that really does underscore how much of a bigger problem this is on freedom of expression, freedom to research, generally speaking, not necessarily just tied to educational institutions, and how these limited strategies we might have to try to respond are simply not going to be enough alone.
It's a really fantastic question. You know, at least half of the researchers we advise at the Knight Institute are not affiliated with the university. So it's, you know, it's not as though this is a 10% problem. There are, you know, many researchers not at universities who face this problem. And I think the most acute difference I have seen in the conversations I have to do with insurance costs. Yeah. You know, university researchers, you know, I speak to, generally what they need is individual counsel outside the context of their university counsel to help them understand where their interests might diverge from the interests of their university, and then to come up with a plan for navigating, you know, those divergences, or hopefully making sure the divergences never actually arise. For private researchers, the question is almost always about how do they pay for counsel. And I only have three suggestions on this front. One is, do your best to get insurance that covers you for as much as you can. You know, I'm not a lawyer who deals with insurance, so I don't know the limits of what you can get insurance for, but do your best to get as much insurance as possible. A second is, there is a fund that is set up now at the Miami Foundation by a number of funders of the underlying work to provide a backstop for researchers whose work comes under threat, and it is meant to help defray legal costs, you know, when a researcher's work is coming under threat. And if that interests you, contact me. The Knight Institute advises that fund in its funding decisions. They make their own funding decisions, but we provide an input into their decision making, and I can help you, you know, navigate that process. And then the third is, try to convince your funders to understand that legal defense is unfortunately now a necessary component of much of this work, and to try, if possible, to secure in advance some commitment that, you know, when you're sued, if you get a demand from Jim Jordan's committee, that they'll have your back at least a little bit to help cover some of those costs. Because the reality is, you know, it's a part of the investment. If the funder is trying to fund the work, often the work can't happen unless you have some money to pay for lawyers, unfortunately.
The last thought I have on that, we are representing a small nonprofit called Neuroclastic, which is an autism advocacy group run by autistic folks, and they were hit with a big cease and desist from a wealthier firm, and that's something that we'd be happy to do. And also, pro bono directors at large firms, I think, would be very interested. So those are my two thoughts. And reforming anti-SLAPP laws. We could go on. I'm on a roll now, but I want to hear more questions.
Hi, thank you again for the talk. I'm a program manager at Tech Policy Press, and I just have one question specifically around what happens when sort of specific researchers come into attack, or research papers come into attack that involve primary research, data sets, surveys, etc. And I wonder, to what extent are you all aware of how that information, or just the sort of the research that has collected, which often can include people, respondents, etc. What happens in those situations? I guess, how much ability do the people who are, you know, harassing these researchers have to access that data that might potentially have other questions around confidentiality and things like that. So just about what happens to the data, and especially in cases of fields that conduct primary research involving human subjects. Thank you.
I haven't seen any lobbying these threats get access to that data. That doesn't mean it hasn't happened. I just haven't seen it. I hope it hasn't happened, but I don't know. Have either of you seen that happen?
No, I remember the Cuccinelli lawsuit against Michael Mann. They wanted him to turn over all of his evidence because they thought that that was indicative of this fraud. So the model legislation I discussed earlier would have at a state level a protection, this is for public university faculty, for turning over that data set. But it's a really interesting question. I think it's a great one for either your institutional or your organizational council, right? Because that should be something that's worked out in advance. My normative answer would be they should have no access to it.
It may be that Renee dealt with this. Maybe we should ask Renee after this panel.
That would be a good person to ask.
I think we can do one more, right?
If you'll let me. My name is Isaac Kamola. I'm the director for the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom at the American Association of University Professors, where Marianne is a fellow. And one of the things that we notice with the, and part of our task is to try to help explain what academic freedom is to a wider audience and make sure that researchers, academics, and others who are doing research understand the principles of academic freedom, that administrators and professional associations and deans and the broader public understands the importance of academic freedom and what is lost when academic freedom is eroded. But one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of the attacks on academic freedom have to do in the realm of intramural speech or actually extramural speech, so the Facebook example. Mm-hmm. And I was just wondering what you see as the kind of ways in which support, like the Research Support Consortium, which really focuses on the value of research, and there's a lot of normative weight around, like, this is scientific research that's done under these conditions, peer-reviewed, et cetera, versus defending the Facebook page, this Facebook post, which may not always be, you kind of have to grin and bear it and say that's extramural speech. I wouldn't have framed it that way. So just kind of thoughts about kind of how this kind of research can help support in the areas of extramural speech as well. Thank you.
I always find these questions really challenging because, in part, what everybody today I think has acknowledged, which is that the right of academic freedom is not well defined, at least in law. AAUP has a great statement of principles from 1915 about what academic freedom means, but there's no consensus in law about what academic freedom means, whether it attaches to the university, for example, or whether it attaches to individual academics within the university. To my mind, there's two principles that operate on university campuses. One is the principle of academic freedom, and another is just the principle of free speech. And not all speech that takes place on a campus, I think, should be thought of as falling within what academic freedom is about. Academic freedom, I think, is ultimately about protecting the ability for society to develop expert knowledge. And not all free speech serves that mission. A lot of speech, most speech probably doesn't serve that mission, and maybe you should be subject to a different analytic framework, altogether, what you're calling extramural speech. That's how I think about it. I don't know that conceptual division answers any of the hard questions about what to do in any individual case, but my instinct would be to have, some conceptual clarity about which framework is trying to do what work.
I would just say, this is part of what we're trying to figure out at the center, and thank you, Isaac, for mentioning it, but disentangling those things, right? To try to say there may be more than one strand here that we need to look at. On the one hand, the point about academic freedom seems right, and we need to clarify what belongs there, but obviously these things are related, because if you're being intimidated or your home address is being published because of something you said on Facebook, it obviously affects your work too. So having the sense of what are the conditions necessary for academic freedom surely include not having your home sort of being publicized to strangers and not having an online mob attacking you. So I think that universities or whoever needs to be thinking about this must be thinking about how true this is academic freedom. There's a certain amount of speech that happens within the academic environment, but things said outside of it may also have a deep impact on whether or not a person is able to continue their research and able to speak freely. And then also to think, though, about how certainly academics, like anyone else, can also be themselves harassing people through extramural speech. And so there's not just one answer to what is a researcher playing, what kind of role are they playing. They might be playing any number of roles. And so to think about that larger ecosystem of what does it mean to have freedom of expression, and to distinguish freedom of expression from intimidation, harassment, silencing others, and things of that nature, that would be a broader, more comprehensive approach that I think we would need to take.
Sadly, that's all we have time. So if we can just thank Alex, Marianne, and Will, thank you so much for joining us. And Dr. Trumbull's going to come back on.
Yes, you may exit. I promise I will keep this brief because we are slightly over time, and the thing that you have to look forward to next is a reception just upstairs on the second floor. You can follow the stairs that are right out here, where we will hopefully talk about all sorts of positive things in the wake of this discussion, and you will have an opportunity for food and beverage. Before I let you go, though, I would be remiss if I didn't say a few key thank yous. First and foremost, to my colleague and dear friend, Professor Kathleen Searles, who has been by my side conducting all of this work, and has been, just a powerful source of inspiration and courage as we've gone through this together. Also to thank the incredible staff at the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics, as well as the School of Media and Public Affairs, who have just done immense work to make this event so successful, and have stepped up in moments when other systems have failed us, and have really stepped in to make sure that this has gone off without a hitch. And of course, last but not least, to thank all of you who have joined us here in person, who have joined us online, for caring about this topic, and for giving 2 hours of your time to sit and reflect on it. And hopefully we'll have the opportunity to reflect some more, both with food and beverage, but also in conversations going forward from today. Thank you very much.